Hey, we're going to do something fun. Last time when we were out here, we talked about rest as a capital R rest in the Bible and what that's all about. We're going to talk about another thing called providence, and the reason is because not just because it's really a fascinating topic to talk about, but it's really integral to where we are in Ezra right now, and you'll see that in just a second. So, in order to introduce what the whole idea of providence is, let me start off with an example, and then I'll give you in my life, and then I'll give you an example at the end as well, because providence is something that's more than just a theoretical, theological thing. It's a reality in our lives every day. So here's example number one. Yeah, many of you know that for years, Karen and Bob and Dorothy and I have been doing work camps, which is a group publishing organizes it. You go to some place, usually a very rural place where there's houses that need renovating because there's usually very elderly residents inside the house who can't afford to renovate their own house. So this is a service project organized by a group, and then youth groups from all over the country would travel to different places, and they would live in a high school. You sleep in the art room. You have meetings in the evening in the gymnasium and the bleachers. And so for years we did that. And I was part of the leadership of this for like 15 years. And I was doing it when we moved here. So just a great thing. So we were down in the Navajo Nation. We were down at Navajo Mountain, I think it was, which is 90 miles from anything. It's 90 miles from Page, Arizona, if you know where Page is, out in the boonies. And Dorothy and I had gone down there. I don't know if you guys had gone on this particular one, but we're down there, and one of the things I ran programs in the evening. I stood up in front of 400 people and ran programs. But in the daytime, we would send the youth out to work on the houses in small teams of 6, 5 students and 1 adult, and they would go out to that house. They'd spend all week at that house, renovating that house, either building a wheelchair ramp or painting or stuff like that. So during the daytimes when I wasn't doing big programs in the evening, I would go out and I'd visit these sites. Well, our daughter Rebecca was there that year, and she said, "Dad, you've got to come out to this one house. There's an elderly woman," which on the Navajo Nation is how it works. There's usually one very elderly person living all alone in a house or a hogan, if you know what a hogan is, out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, out in the middle of nowhere. No electricity, no running water. Their running water is a blue polyethylene barrel outside the back door of their hogan with a ladle in it. And for light, they used kerosene lanterns. So we were going out to one of these places. Not only is it relatively primitive, also the elderly resident, usually does not speak English, only Navajo. So Rebecca had said, "Dad, you got to come out because she has a very special need." Okay, so this one particular day, me and another fella who was in the leadership drove our truck way out in the middle of nowhere. It must have been 15 miles from where we were staying in the high school. We got out there, and I said, "So, Rebecca, what's the big deal?" And she says, "Here, let me bring you over to our resident, this very elderly woman in her mid-80s, and doesn't speak a word of English." And I said to Rebecca, how am I supposed to? She says, "No, you'll get it in just a second." So she walks me up to this elderly lady, and she, somehow she signals that this person can help you. So I'm standing in front of this elderly lady, and then Rebecca says, "Go ahead." And so the lady starts going, "Shuka, shuka, 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 shuka." And I looked at Rebecca and said, "I don't know what that is." She says, No, listen, shuka, shuka, shuka. And then she walked over to the swamp cooler that was mounted in the window of her little house, tiny house. And she turned it on, and the swamp cooler started going, shuka, 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 shuka. And I said, oh, okay, I know. And so Rebecca says, "You know swamp coolers, can you fix it for her?" And I said, "Well, it takes tools and stuff. I can look at it, but I'm pretty sure I can't fix it, but I have an idea what's going on." So I took the covers off the outside of the swamp cooler, which fortunately was not on the roof. It was at chest level on the side of the house. And I opened up the sides of the swamp cooler, and sure enough, the big fan, there's a gigantic squirrel cage fan inside of swamp coolers. It had moved in its axle and had moved so that big squirrel cage fan was actually, the edge of it was eating away part of the support metal that holds the fan, and every time it rotated, it was taking more metal off the support. And a very short amount of time, it was going to eat itself to death and stop working altogether. So, and this poor lady, it was the only source of cooling for her. She would actually take a ladle of water from her blue polyethylene barrel and ladle it on there all day long. Well, She was afraid it was going to die. So I said to the guy that was with me, well, I know how to do this. All I have to do is just move this one pulley on this axle. But to do that, I have to have a hex key, an Allen wrench, to undo that little set screw. And then I can just move this and we'd be done in 10 minutes. But you know what? It's 15 miles back to the high school where we have our tool crib. There's just no way we can fix this right now. I'll just have to come out some other day. Well, the guy that came out with me said, well, how about this one? And he reaches in his pocket and pulls out a single hex key. And I said, what are you doing with that? And he says, oh, and I asked him, do you have a lot of them? Because I'm pretty sure, if you've ever used hex keys to do stuff like that, you got to get the right one. I mean, it's just, you have to have a handful of them. So I said, is that the only one you got? He said, yeah, it's the only one I got. And I said, well, this isn't going to work. And why are you carrying a single hex key anyway? That's stupid. He says, well, this morning I got up at the high school and I decided to unlock the front doors to the school. And to permanently unlock the doors, you have to push that push handle and use a hex key and do this thing, and it sticks open. So I went back to the tool crib. I got this hex key, just guessing that would fit. And then I did it, and it didn't fit. So I thought, well, I should put this back in the tool crib. But I decided just to put it in my pocket instead. And I said, well, it's not going to work here either. We walked over to the swamp cooler, and it fit perfectly. I undid the pulley. I moved it a half an inch, redid it, gave him back the hex key. We both looked at each other and went, whoa. That's providence. That's not an accident. Providence is when God gets what he wants, regardless of the circumstances that seem to be working against it. God gets his way every single time. I'll tell you another story at the end because it's more profound. But many times what we do is we chalk that up to luck. And it's not luck. It's not happenstance. It's not chance. There's too many of these as you look back in a lifetime of how things have gone to say, there's something else going on that we don't see. And so we call that providence. Now, if you think that's just wishful thinking, let me tell you that biblically it is not wishful thinking. It is actually the standard thing. So what I did on the back sheet of your page here, I put some verses there. I wanted to just touch on the most famous verses in the Bible that have to do with providence to show you that biblically this is a profound and solid expectation in our lives. Providence. God gets his way regardless, even despite decisions made by godly people, decisions made by evil people, circumstances that just go to pot. God still gets his way. How is that possible? And the answer is, I don't know. But let me just show you. For instance, probably the most famous verse is Jeremiah 29:11. 29:11 says, these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem. And he goes on and says, I have plans for you. I have plans for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Now, how can God guarantee those plans? Because people come back to that verse all the time. They go, well, my world's falling apart, but even still, God's in control. But it doesn't look like God's in control because the circumstances tend to fake you out. No, you go to Jeremiah 29:11. You go, well, no, God's in control of things. Now, it's the context of that most famous providence verse that pertains to Ezra. So if you go to the beginning of that chapter, beginning of chapter 29 of Jeremiah, where verse 11 is the famous verse, but verse 1 says, these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders of the exiles, to the priests, the prophets, and all the people, whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Well, that's what we're talking about, the people that got taken away in that captivity. They went to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonian Empire was taken over by the Persians, and now we're in the second year of Darius. His reign is where we are in Ezra. And he's writing to those people. He's writing to them about what's going to be happening. In fact, these words of Jeremiah are something that Daniel himself had read when he was in Darius's court in the first year of the Persian king of Darius. He got taken away from Jerusalem. And if you did your homework last week, I gave you an extra credit to read Daniel 9. Beginning of Daniel 9, Daniel says, I got it all figured out. I know how long we're going to be in captivity. 70 years. Why? Jeremiah says so. Why? Because we didn't do our 1 year out of 7 leaving the land fallow. So he figured it out. That's in the beginning of Daniel 9. He says it's going to be 70 weeks of years before this. And every week of years is 7 years. And every one of those, we didn't keep the land fallow. So we're going to be here until the land's fallow for those 70 years. He figured it out. That's in the beginning of Daniel 9. Jeremiah said that. So this is a letter to people who've been taken into captivity, who the circumstances are telling them things are going bad. God is out of control. There is no such thing as providence. There is no reason to have an optimistic viewpoint. We got taken into captivity. Sure, it'll only last for 70 years. But still, is God in control if God allows Nebuchadnezzar to take us into captivity? That's the circumstance. So Jeremiah says, oh yeah. If you skip to verse 4, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Look, verse 5, build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their produce, take wives, have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city. What city? Babylon. Seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find welfare. This is the hopeful words from Jeremiah to the people in exile. Go to the Mesopotamia area and live real lives and live in the midst of the Babylonians, eventually the Persians. They'll see something about you that they've never seen anyone else. That's what God is saying to them. Things are in control. I have a plan for why you are in Babylon. And that's part of that plan. And then you get closer to our famous verse, like if you go to verse 10 just before it. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you. I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare, not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. You mean sending us away from Jerusalem to Babylon was your plan? See, that's the context of 29:11. This was your plan? How can that be a plan? It sounds like you've lost control. No, this is providence. God's plan is still in control when it looks like, to your feeble eyes, my feeble eyes, looks like God's out of control. He's in control. And that's what Jeremiah the prophet is speaking for God. And then he goes verse 12. And then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord. And I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. Even going into exile wasn't God being out of control. That was God being in control. He sent them. But is this providential? Is this something that's good for them? I mean, that's the question that comes up. But there is no question that even though Nebuchadnezzar thought he was in charge of the world when he invaded Jerusalem and hauled away all that stuff and all those people, he thought he was in charge of the world. Of course, later on he was humbled by walking on all fours and eating grass like a cow. But he thought he was in charge. All along the way, God was in charge. That's providence. God's will always wins, even though it looks like everything is bad. The problem in the conflict in our minds is that you and I think we understand what's good for us. And God says, no, I know what's good for you. And for you, Israel, being taken into captivity is good for you. This is what providence is all about. In the end, how does it work out? If you continue in that entire chapter in 29, it's really a fascinating picture. Not just 29:11, which we pull out all the time, but 29:11 in the midst of a catastrophic displacement of the nation of Israel from Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and being sent off to a wacky, pagan, horrible kind of place. And there is somehow in which this entire thing is not an accident, it's under God's control, and it's beneficial for the nation of Israel. That's the amazing thing. Now, if you look at the heart change in the Israelites before they got taken into captivity and after they come back, it's radically changed. And it took something as severe as a captivity to change their hearts and to come back to God. So many times in the problems that we have in life, you can posit, it may not always be the case, but you can posit that perhaps the tough thing I'm going through right now is meant on God's part as our Father in a loving way to change my heart away from a toxic position it's drifted into to bring me back to the purity of what it's all about in terms of finding life and love with God. That could very well be the case. Now, I say that in my case, in our case, because as we look back on 50 years of walking with the Lord, I see as we turn the corner into different calamities and problems. From my perspective, there is no redeeming good in this turn of events. Nothing at all. But that's based on my very short-sightedness. Because after going through the whole thing, and you come out on the other side, you come out and you realize that God has done a tremendous surgery on my heart that could never have been done any other way. But doggone it, it was very uncomfortable. So God's intention for you in his promises and providence isn't to guarantee you a comfortable life. His promise to you is to deepen your love for him and to find life in him, even if that takes catastrophes. That's what providence is all. Providence somehow can supersede all of those things that look accidental and are aimed at our destruction. For instance, when Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem, he had no cares for the well-being of the people in Jerusalem, but God did. So somehow God used the evil of Nebuchadnezzar in order to bring about gold in their hearts. That's providence. Now, providence is God having his way, despite circumstances, despite evil and evil intentions. God still gets his way, but what is it he's intending to give to you in all of this? What is it he always wins in? So let me go a little bit further. Let's try some other passages. Let's go to the most famous person of providence in the entire Bible. That's Joseph, the son of Jacob, Israel. No question. There is no question. If you talk to anyone who's read the Bible, you'd say, show me one person who was the best example of providence, that is God getting his way despite, it would be Joseph. So I went back and I read the whole thing. What I listed on your sheet there is many chapters. Many chapters. So let me just give you the hit list of some of those. Because if you put yourself in Joseph's shoes, none of these things look positive. They look negative. Every single turn in his life looks like that. So if you remember, Joseph is the 11th son of Jacob, the next to youngest, which means that the older brothers are always constantly, you know what older brothers do to younger brothers, right? And especially if that younger brother happens to be most beloved by the father. And why was he most beloved by the father? Because he was finally, after trying 11 times, finally, we have a son from Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife. Finally. So he had kind of a good status. He was a beloved son. And you know the story about the coat of many colors because he loved him. Genesis 37, now Israel, that's Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Any of them. Because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. It was his way of advertising his unique love for Joseph over all the other brothers. How'd they make the other brothers feel? And in fact, I'm sure during that time, Joseph would have wished, gee, I wish I was born like the oldest or next to oldest. Why did I have to be born the youngest? That's just bad. All the bullying that happens from the older brothers. Why did I have to be born so late? So 37:11, his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. That is this dream of bowing to Joseph. So Joseph had this dream that his parents and all of his bullying brothers would eventually pay him homage and subject themselves to him. And as soon as he told this truthful dream, of course, his brothers got incensed. His parents got incensed. And they're like, oh, what's this all about? He was not in a great place. Well, Joseph was just telling the truth, and he was just a youngest son. So why did I earn all this gall from all of my family? That's not fair. Why wasn't I born the oldest or next to oldest? Why did my father have to push his affections on me? Because it makes everyone in the family hate me, and my life is hard because of that. Why? So in that context, although it's nice to be beloved by Israel, by Jacob, still it caused a tremendous amount of problem in his life. Now, if you know the story of Joseph, you know why this is necessary. But at the time, he doesn't know that. You have to act like you don't know that. And so eventually his brothers sell him into captivity, right? Well, that's not fair. Why did God allow this? Why is God being so punitive against me? All I am is the nice youngest boy. Now, at that time, Benjamin was the youngest. And my father loved me. I can't control my dad's love for me. And I can't control the fact that I'm on the younger end, so all my brothers are bullies. And now they've actually decided to get rid of me and live out their jealousy for me by having me be killed. So they throw him in a pit. They intend actually to kill him. The oldest son, Reuben, decides, no, we shouldn't kill him. It's a little over the top, guys. So what do they do instead? Let's just sell him to these traders. Oh, look, here's some traders coming through the land. Midianite traders, they're on their way to Egypt. We'll just sell them, and good luck with that, Joseph. Horrible stuff. Well, they pick him up. The Midianites, this is still chapter 37, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. Coincidence? Or a plan? There's a plan unfolding right here. But now Now, instead of being just sold into slavery, he's being sold into super slavery in terms of this high court house of Pharaoh and this guy. Well, time goes on. He works admirably in Potiphar's house. I mean, very admirably, has the respect of Potiphar, until his wife starts to have notions about Joseph. Remember that? And she tries to entrap him more than once in terms of sexual sin. He, being a man of integrity, decides not to get ensnarled in it. She ends up blabbing on him and getting him in trouble. Chapter 39, as soon as his master Potiphar heard these words that his wife spoke to him, his wife just lied. She said, "This is the way your servant treated me." His anger was kindled, and Joseph's master took him, put him in the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. That's not fair, God. I did the right thing. I'm a man of integrity, and now I'm in prison. But if you understand providence, you understand, no, this is all according to the will of God. Has God lost control? No. Has God stopped loving Joseph? No. But in the circumstance, you and I take that conclusion, and it's wrong. God's providence is above all of those kinds of things. Well, then eventually, while he's in prison, you remember there's a cupbearer and the baker that come in. They're in prison, and there's a dream about them, and he tells them dream and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, the baker is eventually killed when he goes back to the court of Pharaoh, but the cupbearer isn't. And so Joseph says, when you go back into Pharaoh's court and stuff happens, would you put in a good word for me? Well, the cupbearer survived. He survived, just like Joseph's dream said, but he forgot to say anything about Joseph. That's not fair. That's not fair. Genesis 40. So the Pharaoh restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot all about him. That's not fair, God. I'm going to rot in this prison. In the next chapter, in chapter 41, after all this series of not fairs and doing the right thing every time and seemingly not repaid by God for it, you could get a bitter heart through all of this. 41. Pharaoh says to Joseph, I'm having a hard time reading this shield on my eye, so just forgive me. There we go. Okay, so Pharaoh says to Joseph, "See, I've set you over the entire land of Egypt." Remember, there was a dream involved. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand, put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. Okay, God, maybe this is what this is all about, because now I'm living high on the hog. I am now the COO, the Chief Operating Officer of Egypt, Pharaoh being the CEO. In fact, Pharaoh himself says, I give you all of my duties, all my responsibilities, all my power, save the throne itself. I can sit on the throne and you can't. And I can tell you what to do. So he was in charge of all Egypt. So maybe at that point he's starting to think maybe there's something more going on than meets the eye in terms of all these serial downfalls I've gone through. But why become the chief guy in Egypt? That doesn't make sense, but I'll thank God for that. But still, if that series of bad events hadn't happened, and if I hadn't acted with integrity, I wouldn't be here today. But that's not the end of the story. Many times when good things happen to you, like it happened to Joseph, we tend to think, well, this is some kind of karma, if you want to mix a little bad Eastern religion into it. Maybe this is the result of me making good decisions. Maybe I've been good, and so now I have good things happening. No, actually, that's not even the beginning of the end of the story. He's in this position of power for a providential reason. God is maneuvering him there. In Genesis 45, we get to where the boys, the brothers, come back to him. You know, they're desperate. They're dying of starvation in Israel. They send a contingent to go down and buy food from Egypt. Don't know that this 11th son is the one who's now in the place of Pharaoh in Egypt. Who would have ever guessed? They presumed he was dead. So when they first realize who Joseph is, they totally freak out. By the way, Dad is still back in Israel. Jacob is still back in Israel, but the boys are there. And they realize, oh my gosh, this kid that we wanted to kill now has all the power of Egypt. If he wants, just snaps his finger, flashes his signet ring, we're dead. So Joseph relieves them. He says, and now don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. They had meant to not preserve Joseph's life, but God in his providence put Joseph in his place to preserve life because of an oncoming famine coming up, as well as being able to feed the world who was dying. Eventually, in the story, the brothers who still fear for their lives are coerced into going back home and bringing dad down to Egypt. Remember that? Because Jacob is still back home. He does not want to leave Israel, the land of Israel. The reason for that is because he knows that that's their home. Their home is that place back in Jerusalem, in that area. So, I don't want to go to Egypt. They coerce him to come down to Egypt. And when he comes down to Egypt, then Joseph has to also reassure him about what's going on here. There's a bigger plan of providence in place. Boy, that's a lot of P's. And he has to convince his dad, Jacob, that that's what's going on. But listen to how he says this. This is fascinating. It isn't just to feed Israel or feed the world. Genesis 46, God spoke to Israel, that's Jacob, in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, because there I will make you into a great nation. So the reason for coming to Egypt isn't just because of the starvation. It's because Egypt itself is going to be an incubator for the entire nation of Israel. I will make you a great nation there. And of course, you know your history. The family goes down there, the 12 sons, they go down there with all their families. And the next thing you do, you blink, several centuries have passed, and they're a nation of over 1 million people. So in the area of Egypt, God takes a single family, and with the auspices, the generosity of Egypt, causes it to grow into a mighty nation there. And God says, that's why I took you down there, Jacob, so I can turn you into a mighty nation. Of course, you know at the end of that history, things turn. Pharaohs change over. Later, as centuries go on, they forget about what Joseph did for Egypt in terms of saving lives, and so they enslave them, and it gets bad. So you know that's what happens. Fast forward, they leave there, or they come down there, they relocate down there, and then at the very end of the story in Genesis, Joseph and his brothers are standing there next to their father Jacob, and Jacob is on the verge of death, And the boys are still afraid that when Jacob dies, Joseph, who is still the chief operating officer of Egypt, they're afraid that when the protectiveness of Jacob goes away at Jacob's death, then Joseph's going to take us down. That's in chapter 50 at the end of Genesis. That's what they're scared of. What happens when Jacob dies? Then Joseph will kill us. Because here we are in Egypt, and Joseph is still in charge of things. And maybe he's just withheld his vengeance against us out of respect for his father Jacob. So in the context of that fright that they have at the end of chapter 50, that's when the very famous line comes out from Joseph. And he reassures them for the final time that they don't have to fear him. And he says in Genesis 50:19, Joseph says to them, don't fear. Am I in the place of God? That is, am I going to judge you? Don't fear. But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. You see the contrast? This is providence in living color right here. What you did, you meant evil against me. And it was. It was horrible. It was horrible. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Now, providence is the paradox of how can God guarantee good happens when evil is perpetrated? How can he do that? And not he didn't thwart the evil. I mean, they wanted to kill him and sold him to the slave traders and stuff. God didn't thwart that evil. He just let it happen. But somehow, in all of that, God wins. How does God win in the face of such determined evil? And that's the paradox of providence, because he does. He does. God always wins. Now, in the short term, as you go through the life steps that are providence in your life, the very simple things we do from day to day, and things go good, things go bad. You easily call one event good, you call another event bad. Could it very well be that in the midst of that short-sightedness, there is a larger thread of good that's happening that we just cannot see? Yeah, and that's the biblical idea. There is. Is there any sense in which the circumstances we go through will thwart God's sovereign purpose for his love for us? No, it's impossible. It's impossible. Because it depends on what you're looking for in terms of good, in terms of what's good for your life. I would always say that when things are comfortable, things are good. You know, just before we took off for a very short vacation a couple weeks ago, that we needed our car. We're going to drive to the Oregon coast. And 4 days before we left, one car died. That was the car we were going to take. So we went in the shop. So, well, we got a second car. We can drive that one. 3 days after that, that car died. It went in the shop. Now we didn't have any cars. And I'm saying to myself, well, how are we supposed to get to this thing in Oregon? We've paid money for a beach house. We're going to lose $1,000 or something. I mean, we still got, how are we going to do that? We ended up renting a car. But that was really expensive. God, why are you doing this to us? We need this rest. We're very short-sighted. But God solves it. It happened. We went there, came back, deeply refreshed, right? Deeply refreshed. I mean, it still happened. But we're so short-sighted, we think the bad things that happen in our life are things that God has somehow missed. And when you read a lot of the psalmists, they shake their fist at God at the beginning of the psalm. Some of them even go as far as to say, God, are you sleeping? Are you missing this? Well, does the thread of supreme providence of God for our good still exist even in the midst of short-term problems? Absolutely. We saw it with Joseph. Let me give you a couple of Psalms of providence. Psalm 37:4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. That's actually the life verse of John Piper, the pastor from upstate Minnesota. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. You mean even when things are going bad, I'll have the desires of my heart? If the desires of your heart are God himself. If the desire of your heart is for working cars, that may not always happen. If the desire for your heart is wealth, that may not ever happen. You can have lots of desires. But if the desire of your heart is the Lord, guarantee, promise, will not be affected by circumstance, he will give you the desires of your heart. That's the supreme statement of providence. Because what God guarantees in providence, in terms of being in control of things, isn't that life will be easy or that all of your desires will be satisfied unless your whole desire is God himself. And then he promises nothing will get in the way of that. Really? Even in circumstances. Yeah. Another great place in that same psalm further down. I've quoted this many times. The steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. And though he should fall, he shall not be cast headlong, because the Lord upholds his hand. The Lord holds his hand. So there are going to be falls in life, but God has already established your steps. He's provident. He's in charge. He'll get you to where he needs you to be in terms of you fully experiencing the desire of your heart, if that desire is God himself. That won't get in the way. And then another psalm I love, the closing verse in Psalm 16. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. And at your right hand, there are pleasures forevermore. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence, there's fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Few people describe their relationship with God that way, but that's what God says. My providence will always guarantee that happens. So providence is all about God getting his will in the face of what looks like mounting evil and circumstance in your life. But don't make a mistake. He's not there to be some gigantic vending machine of comfort for you. He's there to delight your heart in him. And he will never let circumstance get in the way of your deepening love and joy in who God himself is. That's the deal. That's the deal. So at the end of your life, you can say, well, jobs came, jobs went. We have kids. Some of them turned out okay. Some of them didn't, We had times of fullness. We lost jobs during those times. Sometimes, we went from here, went there. We had bad neighbors in one place. We had great neighbors in another. I mean, you can go through a whole list of what looks like life was goods and bads. But in the end, for a believer, you say, yeah, but despite all that stuff, My heart and my delight in God now is greater than it's ever been my entire life. And God did that. That's providence. Let me move to a New Testament example. This is the most famous verse in the New Testament of providence. People quote this all the time. Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. But what is good? Your good is actually your nearness to God and delighting in who he is. That's your good. That's not running cars or nice neighborhoods. And then just 10 verses later, he spells out what that good is. All things work together for good, according to what is that good? What is good? Capital G, good. Verse 38. For I'm sure of this. Ooh. That's a nice one. Yeah? Mike, what do you think? Horrible. Okay. At the end, he tells us what the good is. Here we go. Verse 38. I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height or depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. The providence of God guarantees it. Despite the ups and downs, you will never be separated from the love of God. And you'll never be separated from your ability to delight and take joy in who God is. And he says, and it has nothing to do with all that stuff. All that stuff. Providence is how God guarantees that the delight of your heart will be fulfilled in him despite everything that happens. There's a lot more you can talk about providence, but God gets his way. What I always like to call it is it's God's way of saying, I am sovereign over my love for you. That is, nothing will get in the way of my love for you. That's what Romans 8 is all about. At the end, nothing will get in the way of that. Yeah, but what about these circumstances that really are bad? Has God's love gone away? No. It's the nearness of God is my good, is what the psalmist says. The nearness of God is my good. Our problem with providence isn't whether God has control over the events of your life. Our problem with providence is we don't know what good is. And we settle for small things as being evidence of good. Actually, what is good for us is relationship with God. That is good. Everything else pales in comparison. Everything else does. And sometimes God uses catastrophes in order to bring our heart's desire back to him, because that's our ultimate good. It's not the loss in the circumstance. It's God's presence. Okay, let me give you one more example and I'll quit. You know Doris Hanson, who has a ministry to polygamists in the state. We met her many years ago, 15 years ago, something like that. And I got a call one day from the manager of TV20 down in Salt Lake City. And he said, hey, look, with all this Warren Jeffs stuff going on, remember Warren Jeffs, who was the leader of the polygamist group down there in Colorado City? He says, with all this Warren Jeffs going on and stuff like that, I think we need to have a live call-in TV show at TV20, and Doris can be the guest, the host, and she can talk about polygamy and how bad it is from a biblical perspective. We can do call-ins and stuff like that. We can do exactly like what Sean McCraney was doing at the time with Mormon people calling in and asking about stuff. We can do that with Doris. We'll put her up in front. We'll give her the telephone. She'll have half an hour to talk about polygamy. It'll be the best thing ever. We need to do this. And Denny's his name. I said, Denny, we've never done anything like this. I'm not sure this is going to work. He said, Well, okay, before you say that, let me tell you a little bit more. For one thing, we don't have any technical staff here who can support you. The TV station runs on a shoestring, and the only paid staff is myself as the manager of the station, and part-time we have a guy who does a little bit of technical stuff, and that's about it. So for you to do this, you need to show up, unlock the front door to the TV station, turn on the equipment, get everything set to go, put Doris on the stage, and at the top of the hour, the automation in the studio will suddenly switch from the satellite feed to whatever's on that stage. And I said, okay, Denny, now I know we can't do this. This is crazy. Oh, and he said, I did tell you about something else. with a call-in show, you're going to have callers coming in. Call screening is kind of difficult. If you're in a professional radio station, it's not that hard because you got software. We don't have software. All we have is four extensions to our telephone here at the TV station. So you need to have someone manning every one of those 4 extensions. And then you need to write down what people are asking about and put it on a piece of paper. And then we'll somehow get the word to Doris on stage about what the question is about and stuff like that. And then she'll hit the button and she'll talk to this person. And I said, we need 4 people to man phones? Yeah, I actually need more than that. You need a runner to run the slips of paper around. It's. So I started adding this up. We need the 4 people on the phones. We need a runner for them. That's 5. We need at least 2 people at the control center inside. 6, 7. We need someone to run the audio board. That's 8. And then there was one more. I forget what it was. Oh, what's that? Running cameras. We had 3 cameras. You had to have one person behind every camera. So that's 8, 9, 10, 11 people. And a floor director. 12. He said, can you do that? I said, I don't think so. So I said, tell you what, let's do this. I know Sean McCraney's doing his show one night a week. Why don't Doris and I and a couple of us, Scott Johnson was with us at the time, we'll just kind of scope out the whole situation. And we'll just see how that whole thing runs, because we're going to have to replicate what he does on one night. We're going to do it on another night. So we went down there. Scott went into the control room, watched what they're doing in the control room. And I sat out in the peanut gallery, they call it, the chairs out where Sean was doing his show. And I sat next to Doris. And all the way through the entire show, Doris kept turning to me maybe half a dozen times and quietly whispered on my ear, I can't do this. I can't do this. I said, what can't you do? You can speak for the half an hour about polygamy and then take calls. No, how Sean does, I can't do this. Let's just abort right now because I can't do this. I said, well, yeah, I don't know. I said, on top of that, we have other problems. I don't know if we can mount the manpower. I don't know if we can deal with the technology. I mean, there's just a lot of things that we aren't good at. So, I don't know. And then at the end of that particular night, I went in the control room, which I hadn't actually been in much before. Scott had been in the whole time. And I said, Scott, so what do you think? Can we do this? And he said, oh, what a great coincidence. It turns out that when I was doing my master's degree in communications, I took a couple of quarters on how to run a control room for a TV station. He says, I know exactly how to do all this stuff. No sweat. I can just sit down and do it today. What? You're trained in running a TV show? Yeah. Wow, that's lucky. And then he said, but I have more concerns about all these equipments. And in front of him, there were about 5 racks of 6-foot tall racks of equipment, top to bottom, of electronic equipment. He says, do you know anything about that? And I said, well, it's lucky. It turns out, I have a degree in electrical engineering, and it's specialized in broadcast electronics. And I scanned all the equipment in the 5 racks. I said, oh, I know what every one of those does. In fact, later on, the station manager asked me to adjust one of them because he never wanted to change the dials on it. So I spent half a day there doing something on it. So I said, so you know how to run a TV show. I know all this equipment, so when we turn it on, I know how to troubleshoot it even. The only problem we have is Doris and our volunteers. Well, as soon as I brought the issue of volunteers, that didn't seem to be a problem. We'd get into 1 or 2 cars and drive down to Salt Lake. Every night that we had the show, it was once a week, even when it was snowing and sleeting, because it's a live show. You have to be there. If nothing's in front of the camera, it's just a blank set. So we went down, we had the volunteers solved, and then finally I went to Doris and said, Doris, you're the last pin to drop here. I think God has made you to do this and you don't know it yet. And we did a couple of shows, and she said, I'm surprised. God has made me to do this show. I said, well, that's just a lot of luckies in a row. No, that's providence. It's providence that Scott took a broadcast course for 2 quarters in grad school. It's providence that God put me in electronics, especially in broadcast engineering, so I could actually fix things while we were there, because it was an old station and needed fixing all the time. God brought together an enthusiastic group of volunteers who we said, we want you to take one night out of your week and we won't get home until maybe 10 o'clock at night. Would you do this? They said, yes, absolutely. Great enthusiasm. And then Doris realized that God had bred something in her heart of passion and boldness on the air that she never knew that she had. So when he put all these things together, it's kind of like God had been planning this for decades. And he had. That's providence. That's providence. We didn't plan this. God put this together while we were all separate and some of us didn't even know each other. God planned this. God has a way of having his way despite circumstances and assembling the people that he needs in order to glorify himself and in the process change us so that our heart's delight is 100% in him and in nothing else, especially in the downturns in life. Providence. So the next time you run up against a downturn in your life and you're tempted to say, God, are you sleeping? I thought your providence is going. Did your providence turn off overnight? Recognize, his providence is not turned off. He's in the process of doing something good for you that you can't even recognize yet. You can't even recognize. And I say that because as we've gone through tough times, Dorothy and I have, really tough times. And after you've gotten through them and you're doing a little bit of soul searching and, thinking out loud about what just happened, and you look back and then you realize what God has done in you that you value so highly because of that event. You say to yourself, well, I don't want to ever do that again, but I understand why it was good from God's perspective. I understand why it's good. And that is providence. Happens all through the New Testament. And then finally, I'm sure probably the most stark example of providence in the entire Bible is the death of Jesus. Who would have thought that at that train wreck of when the mobs convinced the powers to be to kill Jesus, who would think that train wreck would ever come out for anything positive in the history of mankind? That is the worst thing that could ever happen. This is God's prophet, and this is God's Messiah, and they killed him. Dorothy and I were just reading the Pentecost announcement by Peter. And you killed him. You killed him. And everything in our heart says train wreck, train wreck, train wreck. This is the worst thing that could ever possibly happen. And yet, did good come out of that train wreck? Yeah. Did God use evil in order to bring the greatest good known to mankind? Yes. How does he do that? I don't know. I just don't know. But evil is not that powerful, and evil is not sovereign, but the good of God is, in order to bring you to the delight of your heart, which is God himself. That's providence. So next time you think that you're in a train wreck, think of the train wreck of the cross, and think of the good that comes out of that. And don't ever be tempted to wag your finger at God and say, are you sleeping? Because he's not. He's active, he's in control, and his heart's desire is to give you the desire of your heart, which is delighting in God. Okay, let's quit. Father, we thank you that you are indeed in charge, and that our hearts can take refuge in that in the midst of seasons of downturn. Just like when they got carted off into Babylon, they could take comfort in that. They knew through the words of Jeremiah that this was according to a deliberate plan of yours. No, it's not comfortable. It's tragic in so many respects. People died. And yet your plan will not be thwarted. Your plan of love for us, your plan to restore our hearts to you, your plan to delight our hearts in you cannot be thwarted. So God, in the midst of downturns, give us eyes that see the bigger picture, that understand the Joseph story, that understand the Jesus story, understand even the stories of those around us who have experienced the unstoppable love that you bring toward us. Unstoppable. And pray that you give us eyes to see that in the larger picture, good may be poorly defined in our short-sightedness. So thank you for your great love for us now in Jesus' name. Amen.